I think Stephanie mentioned talking about, the process of no longer being a victim and becoming an overcomer. And something I see, and I think you see it too, Stephanie, is that often a partner who is in an abuse situation has to form a clear enough sense of their own sense of self in Christ. I talk about us being temples of the Holy Spirit, and we look at what Jesus did when somebody was defiling the temple in Jerusalem and his righteous indignation about that. And how when we're temples of the Holy Spirit, we're like, yeah, well, no, Jesus was not happy about that, and I'm righteously indignant, and that's not okay. But forming that sense of indignation and what to do in that place of healthy boundaries, self-protection, and what you mentioned about escalating consequences, which is, I think, important, that there's not, this is the consequence, this is it for all time. It's like, okay, I'm going to move out of the bedroom. Okay, now I'm not going to go to church with you anymore. Okay, now I'm going to live at my mother's. Okay, now I'm going to file for financial separation. Now I'm filing for divorce. There's a stepping up of consequences. And at the same time, I think that the abused person who is, trying to reform their sense of self, their sense of dignity, their sense of ability to have a voice and protect themselves, that's incrementally growing as well. So you can't just jump out of the marriage necessarily overnight and all will be well, because if you're a holy mess in the marriage, you have to somehow strengthen up and even plan your jailbreak. I love the movie The Shawshank Redemption, because on day one, that guy was planning his jailbreak, and it might have taken him 20 years, but he made it, So what are your thoughts about becoming an overcomer and how that can happen?
But I think, you talk about the progression. For a while, this person is thinking to themselves, I can just get this right enough to make them okay. And then it starts to dawn on you, wait a minute, it's getting worse, not better. And what I'm doing is making it worse. And then hopefully somebody tells you this is abuse. And then at that point, you change your tactics. And by the way, I'm going to say in this piece of the conversation, one of the reasons that the common church prescription is so destructive is because this person has been taking responsibility for their partner, usually for decades. And when they finally decide not to, and this person, the abuser, goes to a church leader or a group of church people and says, my wife has just given up on me. And the church leaders come back and say, try harder. If you would just, dress up a little bit, if you would just give him more sex, whatever the prescription is for the wife to take responsibility for the abuse victim to take responsibility for the abuser's behavior, that's actually feeding the flame that we're trying to put out. So it's important, because to change the dynamic, two different people have two very different assignments for change. And for the abuse victim to change, they've got to absolutely give up on all responsibility for the other person's behavior choices, internal world reactions, and emotional states. And if to any degree they still think of themselves as responsible, then they're still partially in the abuse dynamic. For the abuser to change, they have to take all responsibility. And the difficulty is, in a non-abusive marriage, it should still be 50-50. And most of the church prescription, many professional counselors who aren't, savvy to this, will look at that and they'll make prescriptions where both people should take responsibility, when in reality, one person's been taking 100% of the responsibility, often for decades. And they've got to put down all responsibility and ask the other person to pick up 100%, not for the relationship, but for the repair of the relationship. If there's going to be repair, the abuse victim has to say, okay, I'm going to stop teaching you how to love me. I'm going to stop encouraging you. I'm going to stop recommending books. I'm going to stop asking you to go to counseling. I'm going to stop all the things I've been doing to try to get you to meet me in the middle. You're going to have to pick up all that. And if you don't, it's very telling about what's taking place. Now, Barb, I have a feeling I missed your question in my response.
The only piece of that maybe we could talk about is, how does an abused person begin to actually become an overcomer? What helps them? Yeah. Where do they resource that? What do they have to change in their mind, heart, and spirit?
I knew there was a giant piece that I was missing. So
yeah, you're doing great. You're doing great. I'm loving every word. I'm so instructed.
I'm so listening.
Right
I'm like, oh yeah, I have a question. I do want to go back to the 50-50 thing, Bob, because this comes up a lot in neurodiverse relationships, because the neurodivergent person is a very black and white, fair, equal person, right? Everything has to be 50-50. Everything has to be fair. Everything has to be level. And so I think the huge piece that I heard you say is, when it's abuse, when there's trauma involved, it's 100-0. If someone is saying to you, you are abusing me, I am being traumatized by you, that person who is being abusive, if it's intentional or not, that is being said, this is abusive, has got to stop saying, weigh in on your responsibility. Talk about your responsibility. Talk about how you've contributed to our marital dynamics. Because yes, probably that person has contributed to the negative cycle through usually covering and buffering. So here's what I hear, Bob, that the woman has the boundary. And like you said, been doing all these things. I'm going to stop doing that. So she pulls back, and now the other partner claims foul. She's moved to another bedroom. They're not having sex with me. They're not running all my errands for me. They're not my executive function lobe anymore. They're saying I have to pick up some slack around the house. That's just tit for tat. She or she is just trying to get back at me, versus seeing it as they've been over functioning the whole time, and now they're trying to function just as a single unit and not doing double duty. But the other spouse, the abusive spouse, says, oh, now you're being abusive to me because I'm not getting my needs met in this marriage. And let's talk about how you're not meeting my needs. I see that a lot. Would you address that before we talk about coming out of the victim mindset and helping?
So it's the boundary thing. The boundary thing is people with abusive thought processes, or they have boundary issues in the other direction. They feel like others are responsible for them. And so if you were to draw it as two circles that overlap, right, you've got this person as the abuser thinks this territory belongs to them. And so when this person says, no, that territory is actually me, the abuser believes this person has taken something that belongs to them, because their boundary so exceeds what's actually their territory. They believe that their spouse's reactions, whatever it might be, body, finances, they believe that actually belongs to them. Right. And so when that person says, no, I'm a separate person from you, this person feels violated because they have believed their whole life that they have the right to take over territory that's not actually theirs. Right. And so that's a big piece of it, is that, it comes, neurodiverse or neurotypical. There's a lot of the things we're talking about that take place in both types of relationships. And that is that there's still an assumption from the one who controls and abuses that they have the right to do that. We talked about how the abuse victim views themselves as a special helper, but it's also important to remember the abuser doesn't think of themselves as an abuser. They could think of themselves as someone who's doing fine, except for one little problem, which wouldn't be a big problem, except that other person keeps provoking it. When in reality, their problem is that they don't manage their own life. It's not just that they have anger. It's not just that they have control. It's not just that they have anxiety. It's that they don't manage those things. And they expect a partner to manage it for them. And so they may say, I'm angry because you stopped doing this for me. But in reality, they're angry because this person said, hey, manage your own life. What is the viral video of the little 2-year-old girl? Do it your own self. Do it your own self. The little 2-year-old girl putting the seatbelt on, and the dad's trying to put it on, and she keeps going, I'll do it myself. I'll do it myself. Anyway, it's the basic idea. So, which brings us really to what Barbara's asking, and super important piece of this, because I think often to get at your answer, Barbara, about how do you enter into the healing journey, let me talk about the end of the journey first as a way to kind of get the the mind clear about that. One of the things, because I work with people in all stages of this, they're still embedded in the abusive relationship, or they've gotten out and they're putting their life back together. And the journey over here is, I think, sometimes misunderstood as well. And that is that I think the journey over here isn't just about healing a bunch of trauma, even though that's important and is a big piece of it. In the healing of that trauma, I think it's crucial to discover again who you were before the abuse and find that person and bring her to life again. Because trauma is one thing, and we can get into talking about what that is and the way I think about that. And we have a couple different ways that we work with trauma, but there's such an attack on identity. So when I think about boundaries, I think about two things. I think about responsibility and identity. Clear boundaries give us a clear sense of self. And when we have a clear sense of self, our identity is strong and resilient, and we can bounce right back. But year after year after year after year of attacking that boundary and eroding that boundary, the abuse victim's sense of self starts to become either I'm that abused person, or I'm just no good, or I can never, they're so eroded in their sense of self. And yet the reality is the person they were before the abuse hasn't gone away. They've just been buried under years of erosion. And so to rediscover that person, to take the dirt off the top and start to discover who she is, if that person was an athlete, go out and do your sport. If that person was a musician, pick up your instrument again. If that person loved the outdoors, get back out and go camping. Whatever it is, find that person again. Now, the reason I say that is because that's also what you need to do to start getting out. If you've been taking responsibility for the other person all along, you've also been giving up your own responsibility. Barbara, you said something at the very beginning of the podcast, and I'm trying to remember what it was, but I started to speak up and say, what I tell people is, on the way out, do it different than how you stayed in. If you stayed in by being silent and just kind of tolerating, then on the way out, learn to speak up.
Right.
If you stayed in by fighting and, really, getting aggressive to survive, then on the way out, just quietly be strong. But whatever it is that you gave up to be where you are, start by recapturing that as you leave. And I think a lot of people want to just duck their head and get out. And what they miss is the opportunity to exercise the muscle that's atrophied for however long they've been in it. And then they get out and they want to get back into another relationship, or they just want to do their own recovery. And that muscle that had been lost in the marriage didn't get strengthened. And sometimes the exit can be years. So if their muscles are atrophying over years, I have a personal experience. I had an injury back in my late 30s, early 40s. And so I stopped running and I started just doing the elliptical. Well, this year I started running again, and I discovered there are muscles that I haven't used in 20 years. And I'm really having to rebuild some muscles that have atrophied because I've been exercising like this instead of like this. Yeah. And I've got to change my muscle structure in the same way. The woman or man who's been constantly carrying the weight of their partner has to start using those muscles that they gave up on to stay in. Because on the way out, A, it's the way out. B, I think you used the phrase getting out of the victim mindset. Now, the victim mindset isn't just, oh, poor me. It's, I'm responsible for everybody.
Right.
And to stand up and go, I'm going to take responsibility for me. And when you ask me to take responsibility for you, this is important. I'm going to firmly and gently say, that's you, not me. And the reason it's important to be firm and gentle is because if you get aggressive, you're still in their territory and you're still in the enmeshment or the boundarylessness.
Right.
The degree they can provoke your emotions, they still own a part of you.
Right. Yeah.
But when you can be able to, with less and less emotional escalation, say, that's not the way I'm going to do that. I'm not going to play that game anymore. Yeah, you can believe that, but I'm not going to defend myself.
So to what extent, too, is having a team of healthy supporters and people who see us clearly, see and value us more and delight in us. There's this whole Hesed relationship that Stephanie references, the work of Dr. Jim Wilder, the idea of a healthy connection where joy lives, and learning to be with people, building. I talk about it. Build your team of people that you are being strengthened by, who believe in you, a team of advisors, team of playmates, team of friends, team of soul-seeking people. Is that also part of the equation, that sometimes we can't go it alone because we've been so isolated for so long, we have lost a sense of ourselves?
Yeah. Well, isolation is one of the tasks of the abuser, right? They want to get the victim as isolated as possible, so they're their source of truth. But it also becomes kind of a secondary task of the victim because they lose trust. They lose trust because they've been hurt so many times by their abuser. They lose trust because of the third party response, the Cassandra effect that you talked about. And so I think there's multiple reasons why finding, I've often said there's trauma-informed counselor is not the same thing as an abuse-informed counselor. Trauma is the impact on the nervous system. Abuse is the relational dynamic. And you can find people who are really great at trauma, but don't have a clue about the abuse dynamic that we're talking about today. By the way, for 15 years of my practice, I didn't have a clue. So when I say that, I'm not being critical of other practitioners. Yeah. It took my own experience for me to realize what I had been missing for 15 years of being in practice. Mm-hmm. And so, but then there's some other really important pieces of that. Number one is it breaks the cycle that you've been in. Number two, it gets you out of the survival part of your brain and up into the limbic system. The survival part of your brain is absolutely not going to change anything. In fact, it's how we maintain patterns. You get into connection and immediately you start firing your limbic system and start, letting some oxytocin into your system. That in itself is a significant part of the healing journey. Number two, socially speaking, I lost track. Is it number two? Whatever.
Maybe another one.
Mission two.
I've always described that, in a family growing up, the way we know who we are is what our family mirrors back to us. And so people become mirrors by which we know, or at least start to develop a sense of who we are. And in an unhealthy family, we obviously develop an unhealthy sense of who we are. In the same way, in an unhealthy marriage, we start to mirrors back to us an inaccurate picture of who we really are. And then, to get with some people who are healthy mirrors, who can consistently say, no, you're not stupid. No, you're not bad. No, you're not ugly. No, you're not evil. Who can reflect back to them, not just in language, but in conduct. Listen, everything you've experienced in this relationship about who you think you are, you're not going to experience that in these conversations. And so it's crucial, Barbara. I love the inclusion of that. It's a crucial piece of the puzzle.
Yeah. How about, I see it very often, I think you do too, Stephanie, that partners attract each other for different reasons. And there's often what we would call the anxious attached person chasing the avoidantly attached person, the pursuer distancer dynamic. And so I was one of these abused people growing up. My mom had PTSD from World War II, and it was, I had to escape the home in order to eventually find myself. But I married in a time where I didn't really have a sense of myself. I didn't have that well-established, this is the healthy me. And sometimes, we choose a partner who is going to perpetuate the patterns of unhealthy relationship, in some cases abuse, if we were abused as children. So some survivors, some people who are trying to overcome, don't even have an original who was I to go to. And they have to discover that in this journey out of abuse into survival and thriving. I use the who are you in Christ sense of who you are as the primary identity factor. But what can you say about that in terms of how people can understand that abuse may be a lifetime habit, and that's not who God made them to be?
Yeah, honestly, my wife, my current wife, so I'm remarried after the marriage that I talked about. My wife would be one of those because she had childhood sexual abuse starting at age 3. And so during the years that you would be forming a sense of self and where a family is supposed to mirror back to you, one of the things that's true in her story is that she did have some healthy adults and some unhealthy adults. Her abuser was blood relative. And, but so, some of her blood relatives were part of the abuse dynamic, but some of her blood relatives were really kind and made a safe place for her and mirrored back to her a true sense of what a little girl should know about herself. And then she had an experience in her teenage years where she had a stepfather that she calls her second chance daddy. And it's so what you're describing is frustratingly common. Sometimes I'm so ready for Jesus to come back and get us out of this world, because there's so much darkness and so much destruction that happens so young in people's lives. But she's also a testament to the fact that between going back to look at what the healthy adults reflected back to her, creating emotionally transformational experiences where she found other safe relationships that were safe, doing her trauma work. She did years of EMDR with a highly trained, just because someone does EMDR doesn't make them an artist. And we worked hard to find somebody who really had the, not just the certification, but the experience. And so she really did her work, but she also recreated a new system around her, including our marriage. And so those things can rebuild, or I guess we're talking about building a sense of self that didn't previously exist. And unquestionably, every step of the way, it's also been her relationship to Jesus that becomes the anchor for all of that. And in many ways, the source for all that. Many of the people and circumstances where the real healing took place in and through that relationship. And so it is much more of a challenge, I would say, when you have no childhood sense of self. But we're never left completely without it because we're created in the image of a creative God. And somewhere in there, even if we never experienced it as a child, the seed of that creator is still somewhere in there that we can find in relationship to him and in relationship to healthy people.
Absolutely. I think I'm thinking of a couple of people listening to this thinking, wait a minute, I hear that people who come from an abusive maybe background or trauma background end up in these kinds of marriages. But I think also in the neurodiverse Christian couple, it might be the person fell in love with the church version of that person. Maybe that person was masking. Maybe that person didn't even know their own identity, but they're like, oh, this person's going to be a pastor. They're a theologian. Oh, they know ancient languages. Oh, they're a missionary. Oh, they're at this prestigious Christian university as a professor. And it's like they pray for 2 hours a day and they're always at church. But that could be an autistic, a special interest, black and white thing. Yeah. And I'm not discounting the faith of those on the spectrum. I'm just saying at the beginning of attraction, specifically a woman like who maybe came from a high joy, healthy family, like I have found this Christian man and he's doing all these things that check all the Christian boxes, but again is with that church out version of that person, because in Christian marriage, we believe in abstinence before marriage. We believe not to live together. And so you kind of don't know what you signed up for sometimes until you're behind closed doors. And now that 2 hours of Bible study might be a problem when they don't want to help with the children or don't want to go to work or, something like that. So I think that could be another dynamic, right?
Yeah, you hit something that's so important. And it also hits on, we talked about what the abuse victim has to do to change, but we haven't really talked about the abuser. And what you just hit on is, if I can respond to that, gives us the root then of what the abuser would have to do to really, truly change, or for someone to really know that they've changed. And that is that, so licensed marriage and family therapist, been doing marriage and family therapy since 1991, which is a long time ago. And in my premarital counseling, as much as I do work with believers, I often have to help them understand that, we can over spiritualize what we're looking for. And the thing I tell people is this: listen, look for empathy. look for kindness, look for responsibility, and look for mutuality. So we are all grown-ups in 2025, and we've seen how many people know the biblical languages and have abused people. We've seen how many people have achieved high levels of pastor status, and we discover that they're living a double life. We see how many people have, high visible Christian positions, and yet somehow are also victimizing people in their congregation. And the reality is that it's easy to put on the clothing of religiosity, but to pretend that you're kind, to pretend that you're mutual in relationship style, to pretend that you're empathic, and to pretend that you're responsible is almost impossible over time. And those qualities make a marriage work far more than the kind of things that we spiritualize and everything you just described, And I get it. It's like if you were raised and your pastor was your hero and you're dating a guy who's going to be a pastor, it kind of feels like, but we've got to tell younger people, look below the outside, look below the exterior, because the attraction process is a little bit of a trap. Barb, you were saying sometimes we marry and end up repeating patterns. I'm like, maybe 99.9% of the time. We marry, and at some degree, we only know how to repeat what we've always known, unless we've really done some of our own deep work. And so we've got to teach people to look for those character qualities and not those external things, which is also the answer to how do you know that an abusive person has changed? I always say, look for two things over time. Number one, empathy. Does this person consistently show empathy? Do they have a sense and express a sense of what it's like to be you in relationship to them? Which I realize is a challenge in the neurodiverse relationship, because empathy is often one of the things that's just kind of assumed it's not going to be there. If you need empathy, then writing's on the wall. You're either going to have to do without that or figure out how you're going to live in relationship to somebody who claims they can't and may possibly not be able to demonstrate empathy. But empathy and responsibility over time is the formula to know, has the abusive person changed? Because anyone can, it's that dynamic where, the person finally sets a boundary and this person says, oh no, how do I get them back? All I need is 2 months of performance. Most people can manage performance for 3 months. Beyond 3 months, it starts to really stress their system to try to be something that they're not. And if somebody can't have empathy and take responsibility, then you'll always, to some degree, be in that abusive dynamic with them.
Man, that seems like the place to stop right there. We're looking beyond just someone's Christian pedigree and who they say they are, but what's the character? Because we confuse that sometimes in the Christian church, like, oh, it's I don't smoke and I don't drink and I don't watch these movies. Like, that's my morality, that's my character, but no, character is who you are in many, many situations, kindness, empathy, all of that. So thank you so much for being with us today, Bob. Please go check out more of his things. It's Think Differently, correct? Think Differently?
Think Differently Academy is our online presence.
Okay. All right. Think Differently Academy. I have learned a lot from today.
Good.
Yeah, we could also include a link, I think, to that well-known Facebook viral video. I think I've sent many people that one. Is that the one where you draw the diagrams? And yeah, I know that one.
Make sure I get that.
It's actually free on Think Differently Academy. So Think Differently Academy is a subscription site, but because that one has been so important for people, that one's free. It's on this side of the paywall. And by the way, the subscription is $12 a month, so it's not like we're asking a lot. We just need to maintain our site. But that one on the dynamics of abuse, and then another one I can't remember right now, we've committed to always have those free and available. So there's a series of 3 on abuse, and they're all free on that site.
Excellent. Okay. Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We will remind you, listeners, that Uniquely Us is now out by the time that this has been released. And we talk about in chapters 12 and 11, we define abuse. And we didn't talk about too much today, but financial abuse and financial power is a common thing that we see in neurodiverse Christian couples where there's abusive situations. But in chapters 12 and 13, we define abuse and how do you know you're in an abusive relationship. And so you can explore that more in Uniquely Us. Buy it wherever books are sold. We like to remind you always that you're not alone on your journey and there is hope for your future.